The episode of the Joe Budden podcast that Joe Budden refused to release.
The truth is, I just felt like nobody had nothing to say. And if nobody got nothing to say, when we have something to say, we should say something. Like, none of us should ever take the audience for granted, the platform for granted. And I tried to get Ish on the phone. Like, I'm going to speak to everybody individually just so they know I'm all right. I'm a deranged, psycho, perfectionist, Virgo. I'm hard on myself. I'm hard on the people I love. I'm hard on the people I work with. And if people aren't built for that, I would prefer them to not be around me because that's just how I am.
If you don't remember, there was an episode of the Joe Budden podcast that Joe Budden was so mad about that he canceled it mid-podcast and sent the co-host home. Now, we're going to look back and examine this classic moment in the Joe Budden podcast history, largely because I think it reflects a time in the show when it was undergoing great transition and might say something about the show today. Now, when this episode was recorded, it was a big controversy, as it was basically revealed that Joe Budden had everyone come in, that's Ish, Ice, Melissa Ford, Parks, Queens Flip at the time, who was new, and during the podcast, he was so frustrated that he stopped mid-podcast and said, all right, y'all, we good. We're not going to release it. And he recorded the whole podcast, but still decided not to release it. But what was interesting is the subsequent issues that arrived as a result of this podcast. Right? This podcast was the beginning of Danny from the Stop versus Queens Flip. And I'll get to that a little bit later. But first, let's talk about why Joe Budden decided to cancel this podcast. It seemed like, at the time, the reason Joe had an issue with it was because of Ish. Now, Joe Budden would go on to say after that there was no issues with Ish, but you could kind of read between the lines and see that Joe felt as if Ish did not prepare for the podcast, as he was coming from a vacation or a break and he kind of just sauntered in and was half-stepping. Now, what else could Ish have done on this podcast? Well, there was the whole notion of daylight savings time. Right? In the live with Joe Budden and Flip, you could hear Joe say something about daylight saving times. And at the time, one of the debates being had, or one of the topics being discussed, was that daylight saving times was ending and that they were going to get rid of it. But that was later proven untrue. And I firmly believe that what happened that set Joe off was Ish came in there with a firm rebuttal and said, daylight saving time is, it's ending.
What happened at the start of yesterday, like that's important to note. When we got to the end of that podcast, they started talking about daylight savings time, and this might be the last daylight savings time. Yeah. That was enough for me.
And Joe was probably like, no, it's not. We researched it. It's clearly not. And that caused the show to kind of get derailed. And Joe felt like, as a creative endeavor, it just didn't need to be released. And that's one thing that happened. The whole podcast was ready to be released, and there was enough content, but Joe Budden felt like the members of the show were not taking the platform seriously. And if you look at Joe's critiques, a lot of the times over the last year or so during the Bionic 6 era, Joe felt as if members of the show were not taking it seriously. And the funny part is I think at this time Joe would have done that, but I've seen a lot of episodes since where Joe has not done this. And I think the cast of the show is overwhelming Joe Budden's creative control. Like, there's been episodes that are probably worse than this that Joe just let fly because he needs to make content and releases a half-step product. But another thing I wanted to examine was how this was the beginning of Queens Flip versus Danny from the Stop. So after this thing happens, Joe Budden does a live with Queens Flip. Queens Flip is very I don't know how to say it. He just seems like he's trying to be really like cozying up to Joe. You got to remember, this was the beginning of Joe and Queen's Flip's experiment. And he was brand new to the show. And Queen's Flip was like, "You work a lot, Joe. You know, Joe, it's hard to manage a lot of people at once." And this is so far removed from the Queen's Flip that we would see later on, where he was just didn't seem as understanding of Joe being a businessman or Joe having to deal with multiple personalities. It was very different coming from Queen's Flip. So I would go on my YouTube channel and I would say that I thought Queen's Flip was brown nosing. Beyond that, Queen's Flip is a bit of a brown noser. I mean, look at this clip of when the show was canceled and how Queen's Flip was talking.
And I had a really long work week.
Yeah, I think you did. You overworked yourself, man. You know, I had to pull Joe outside and talk to him as the boss.
Queen's Flip took that to heart. That very much bothered him. The term brown nosing, I think, hurt his feelings. And he would later go on to Improper Improv and highlight how he had issues with those terms and other bloggers like Poetic Flacco.
Obviously, the old employees are having enough of Flip sucking up to Joe.
Making statements saying that he was going to be the reason the podcast ended. At the time, the Joe Budden podcast was in flux. It was still good, but Queen's Flip and Melissa Ford's arrival was very much something that I don't think Ish and Ice enjoyed. At the time, Ish had admitted that he never met Queen's Flip until he came to the podcast, which to me shows improper planning. So this was a very interesting time of transition for the Joe Budden podcast, and I don't want us to forget, as it says a lot about the show now, and that's why we had to look back. But let me know what you think in the comments, y'all. Do you remember when Joe Budden canceled episode 609 of the Joe Budden podcast and sent everyone home? Now, I know an episode came out called 609, but there was still an episode that didn't come out. There was an episode where he had everyone come in. He wasn't satisfied with the product. So he told everybody, get out. We'll try this again. Salute. We don't need you around here. And very fascinating because, you know, Joe doesn't like to do that. He barely ever misses a show. Even when he's been absent, he had the Bionic Six take over and do their thing. But for Joe to cancel the whole show, that means something big was up. Alright, y'all, that's my deep dive video for today. Let me know what you think in the comments. Let me know if you forgot about this, because I didn't. This is why this channel exists, to remember the moments they don't want us to remember. The Stop remembers. And with that being said, follow me on Instagram, The Stop TV. Follow me on Twitter, The Stop TV. And subscribe to my new channel. I've been posting videos there. It's called Danny from The Stop. It's going to be my sports channel. I'm going to have a Kevin Durant video dropping later. I really think he sucked. All right, y'all. This is Danny from The Stop. Peace.